True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Debra Milke was a cute 24-year-old single mother back in 1989. She and her 4-year-old son Christopher were living with a friend while Debra prepared to move into her own apartment and start a new job. She was excited for what she saw as a fresh start, saving up new clothing and household items for her and Christopher's new life. But then on December 2nd, Christopher disappeared. Join us at the quiet end for Dead Woman Walking. When Debra's son went missing on a trip to see Santa Claus, she appeared to be frantic, trying to do everything possible to find her son and bring him home safely. Debra readily spoke with the police. But when one detective finished interviewing Debra, he claimed to have a confession. Debra, he said, had had her son murdered to collect on a small life insurance policy and to escape the responsibilities of motherhood. Put on trial for murder and then abandoned by most of her family and friends, Debra would find herself living a 20-year nightmare, which was likely to end with her execution by lethal injection. And this happened in Arizona. What do we have for a beer?
We have a beer from Four Peaks Brewing Company called Hopknot, K-N-O-T. This is an American IPA, 6.7% alcohol by volume. It's an okay beer. I'll just leave it at that. It looks nice. It's gold, small white head, some lacing. But the aroma and the taste are kind of lacking. Get some citrus and pine on the aroma, a little sweet malt. And on taste, I can tell there's caramel there, kind of muted citrus and pine. And it's not that hoppy for an IPA. So it's reasonable. I would not turn it down.
Well, you know what I think of these beers sometimes is if you're a consistent Bud Light drinker or something and you want to try and venture into craft beer. This is the kind of beer maybe to start out with.
Yeah, it might be a good entry beer.
Exactly. Okay. Well, let's open it up. All right. Let's cozy up here for a long discussion, kind of a complicated case that went on for years and years, but I really did find it fascinating, so I think our listeners will enjoy it too.
Yeah, fascinating and frustrating.
Yes. Yep.
So as 1989 was coming to a close, Debra Milke was preparing for her future with a new job, a new apartment, and a new preschool for her son. As the psychiatrist would later tell a jury, Debra was a young woman on the upswing of her life. She had filed for sole custody of her son, and she was building from scratch the kind of life she wanted for them. Things were looking up, most definitely. Now, Debbie had married her boyfriend, Mark, when she was very young, and she had tried to get him to be a responsible father for 4 years. He was the opposite of any other boyfriend Debra had ever had, but he was good looking, and she was intrigued by his bad boy persona.
That'll get you, girls. You got to watch out for that.
I tell you.
Yep.
She had successfully worked hard to change herself from a party girl to a competent young mother. And Debra said that when Mark was sober, he was a good husband, a good father, and a good provider. That's just a problem if you have to say statements like that.
When he was sober?
Yeah. You know you're in trouble.
Yeah.
But he was addicted to drugs, and he was incapable of being there for his wife and child. In fact, the court had approved a protection order after Debra had gone to court with her concerns that Mark was a danger to herself and their son.
Yeah, so soon after Debra had made up her mind to leave Mark, she spent her lunch hours searching for an apartment close to her new job. In early November, she filled out an application at the Garden Grove apartment complex in Tempe, and she explained on the application that she was recently divorced and had bad credit, but that she did have a stable job and she would pay her rent on time. She really just needed someone to give her a chance. So by Thanksgiving, she learned that she was approved for the apartment, and she made plans to move in on January 13th. Debra didn't intend to give Mark her new address. Now this was supposed to be a fresh start. She hadn't even told her friend, Jim Steyers, who'd taken her and her son Christopher in when she had nowhere else to go, where they were moving to. So when Debra's mother visited her back in late September of 1989, Debra had showed her a box under her bed that was filled with new clothes she'd bought for herself and for Christopher. "We're saving these for our new life," she told her mother. This under-the-bed stash also included a set of dishes, pots and pans, and towels. Their new life was going to be different from their life with Mark, and hopefully different from Debra's own childhood. Debra did like to remember her childhood for the times her dad read to her and her sister, the comforting dinners her mother would make for them, and their fun birthday parties. But she also remembered her father as a strict disciplinarian. Now, out of the two girls, she was the good daughter who never got into trouble, got good grades in school, and always did what she was told. Debra's father, Richard, was an Air Force tech sergeant, and her mother, Renata, was from Germany. Renata was smart, athletic, and beautiful, and she'd actually qualified for the Olympics in the 100-meter dash back in 1960. But because her family couldn't afford to send her to Rome, she wasn't able to compete. But she excelled in school and learned multiple languages. By the time she was 20, Renata was working for the biggest bank in Berlin, and she was still living at home with her parents. So Renata's life was going pretty well when she went to a birthday party for a friend on February 3rd, 1963, and met Richard Sadiq. His constant attention was flattering to Renata, even though her family didn't like him at all. He courted her, giving her gifts and taking her out to nice places. He introduced her to his friends, and they were always doing fun and exciting things. She would say that the first time she slept with him, she got pregnant. So they were married just 1 month before Debra was born, when Renata was 22 years old and Richard was 27.
So Debra was born in a U.S. military hospital in West Berlin in 1964. Later in life, she would recall that her parents never fought in front of her and her sister, but they could hear the arguments coming from their bedroom at night. So their father verbally abused their mother and insulted her right in front of the kids. Because they were in the military, the family moved frequently, and they ended up living on a Phoenix Air Force base. When Debra was 14, their parents divorced. Their father moved out, taking the family dog, and the girls stayed with their mom. When Debra turned 16, her dad remarried, this time to his high school girlfriend, and she had her own teenagers. After he remarried, Debra felt like her dad wasn't interested in her or her sister anymore. He became like a stranger. He was an alcoholic, he was very distant, and his new wife just wasn't very friendly either. She, in fact, would complain if the girls talked about their mother in front of her.
Yeah, because Debra was pretty close with her mother. Renata, who'd been born in Germany, was beautiful and very responsible, but she was away at work much of the time. Debra was proud of her mother's strong work ethic, even though she missed her, and she wanted to be like her. So when she was 16, she got her first job. The divorce eventually resulted in the loss of their big house, so the girls and their mom ended up moving into an apartment in Phoenix. Renata eventually decided that Debra's sister Sandy was just too much for her to handle. She was always getting into trouble, so she sent Sandy to live with her father. And that left Debra and her mother living alone together. And Debra would actually remember this time very fondly with just the two of them. She was an honor student, she graduated in 1982, and then she enrolled in community college to study business management. But then when Debra was 19, her mother was offered a new job in Germany, and Debra felt really abandoned. Renata told Debra that she could move to Europe with her, but Debra didn't want to leave her life in the U.S. She just wanted her mother to stay in Phoenix and find another job there. But in early 1983, Renata moved to Stuttgart. She left Debra, a college student, in the apartment, promising to help her out with the living expenses while she was in school. And Debra moved in 2 girlfriends in the apartment with her to help with rent and to keep her company. But Debra did resent her mother, who she saw as their only real parent, and for the first time she began to rebel. And that's when she began seeing 21-year-old Mark Milke. He was very rough around the edges, and he had a drinking problem, which would only get worse when he added drugs into the mix.
So he liked his alcohol? He liked his drugs?
Yeah, he was kind of a biker type.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Doesn't look good.
Well, her friends and her mother warned Debra about him, but she was in love, and they were soon married. And in the beginning, Mark did have a steady job as a carpet layer. But then he was in and out of jail from drug-related charges and DUI offenses. And the marriage was almost all bad. But Debra loved their son Christopher. They divorced in 1988, and Renata was very supportive of Debra as a single mother, and she really adored her grandson. That's when Debra got an order of protection for herself and Christopher after she found Mark in a crack house with their son while on a scheduled visit. And then he had physically attacked her to boot. So he was on a bad road, at least at that point.
Yeah, he was on the downward spiral.
Yes. So without Mark coming between them, the mother and daughter were close again. They were even getting along better with Sandy, who'd moved to Wyoming. Debra put aside their past sisterly differences, and she thought that all of the bad blood was behind them then. So she never would have predicted that one day Sandy would testify against Debra in court. That's a betrayal, I guess.
Yeah, those families stay together, don't they?
Yeah.
So when Debra had nowhere to go in July of 1989, a family friend named Jim Steyers gave her and Christopher shelter in his apartment. Steyers was 42 years old, a disabled Vietnam veteran with a 2-year-old daughter who lived with him.
Lived with him part-time, lived with her mother also.
So living together was convenient, certainly, and according to both parties, platonic.
Yeah, Debra would say that he did make a pass at her early on, but she told him no, and since then they'd just been good friends, and he'd never tried anything again. But there'd be a lot of talk about that relationship, and if she was using him, and what his thoughts were. And then when Debra got a job, she'd paid Jim to watch Christopher for her. And little Christopher adored Jim, and Debra grew to trust him completely. But Jim Steyers had his own mental health issues. He was on lithium and another antipsychotic medication. And later this information would be used to portray Debra as someone who was manipulating and using Jim Steyers just for a place to stay and to have a babysitter.
Okay, I don't know about that. Well, it seems like she was pretty thankful to him for taking them in. I mean, this guy kind of saved her.
It seems like it. And, he seemed like a decent guy.
Yeah.
He had a 2-year-old. Christopher liked him. He took good care of the 4-year-old, from all accounts. But, people are a little suspicious about a 42-year-old man having a 20-something-year-old woman move in.
Well, yeah.
And also leaving your child in the care of an adult man that's not a relative can sometimes be looked at suspiciously. And, you do have to be careful. But from everything I read about prior to any incidents, Jim Steyers did seem reliable, kind, and like a pretty good guy.
Right. So when Debra got home from work on Friday night, December 1st, 1989, Jim Steyers asked to borrow her car so he could go to the mall and do some Christmas shopping. He had just received his government disability check, like he did on the first Friday of every month. So he wanted to take Christopher and his 2-year-old daughter Wendy with him. Then he would drop Wendy off at her mother's house for the night. So this seemed a good idea, because Debra liked getting her laundry done on Friday nights. That's when the apartment machines were more available. None of the other residents wanted to spend their Friday nights in the laundry room.
Can't blame them for that.
Me either. Saturdays and Sundays were busy, which meant waiting your turn for the machines. It was also easier to get things done if she didn't have to take Christopher along with her, because she had to carry baskets of clothes up and down stairs and over to the next building. So there was nothing unusual about that evening. Jim borrowed Debra's car often because his was broken down and he couldn't afford to fix it. In return for babysitting Christopher during the day while she worked, she let Jim use her car. So a nice arrangement.
It really seemed to be. And Debra definitely knew that she was lucky to have the car her mother had bought her back in September. It was a reliable late-model Toyota. So Debra was sitting on the couch sorting through her clothing when she emptied a pocket on Jim's jeans and found a sealed box of bullets. She did know that Jim had a gun because he'd showed it to her when he bought it. She wasn't happy about it because she didn't want a gun around Christopher. But this living arrangement was temporary, and Jim promised to keep the gun in a box on a high shelf in his closet, out of Christopher's reach. So Debra put the bullets in her purse that was nearby on the couch so they wouldn't be lying around for Christopher to find. She put them in a zippered purse pocket for the time being until she could tell Jim to put them away. So Christopher came home that Friday night smiling and excited. He'd seen the mall Santa Claus, and he reminded Debra that she'd promised that he'd get to meet Santa this year. Jim had even bought an early present for Christopher, a remote-controlled car that he raced all over the living room floor. As usual, he'd bought Christopher's favorite gummy bears for him, too. And Debra and Jim were talking about getting a Christmas tree. She'd already told him she was moving out after New Year's. She had delayed moving until after Christmas to give Jim more time to find another roommate, plus she thought it would be nice for them to spend the holiday together. So Debra went to bed that night full of anticipation for the new life that lay ahead for her and Christopher. She was planning to buy Christopher a 2-wheel bike for Christmas, and she'd already bought a toy piano on a payment plan through Fingerhut. Christopher was quickly outgrowing his big wheel, which he really loved, and his new bike would have training wheels. But Debra knew he wouldn't need them for long. He was a very adventurous boy for whom training wheels would soon just get in the way.
And although Debra was a young mother, and raising her son alone wasn't always easy, she would always look back on his birth with joy. And as he grew up, she marveled at his sense of curiosity. He kept bugs in his pockets because he thought they were homeless. He loved to go for walks and see the grass, the trees, and the creatures. Debra had potty trained him with a Cabbage Patch doll, who came with a birth certificate and the name Leon. So he was 2.5 and diapers were expensive. But after Debra showed him that Leon could use the potty, Christopher began to use it too. And after that, he was very proud to be wearing his superhero underwear instead of diapers.
So Christopher was thrilled on the morning of December 2nd, 1989. He was going to see Santa Claus for the first time, sit on his lap, and tell him what he wanted for Christmas. Christopher had only been 2 months old on his first Christmas, so he was still too little to know who Santa was on his second Christmas, and for his third Christmas the previous year, he was in the hospital with a thyroid condition. Debra had sat with him in the hospital and tried to make it a nice Christmas, and she'd promised him that the next year would be better. He would be 4 and healthy, and he'd finally be able to meet Santa Claus. So that December 2nd, Christopher woke up at 5:30 a.m. in the small bedroom he shared with his mom. He woke Debra, got up, and he peeked into Jim Steyers' room to see if he was awake. Debra woke up and she passed Jim in the hallway. He asked her if he could borrow her car to take his daughter Wendy to the Metro Center Mall. Christopher overheard this and saw his chance to see Santa Claus. Debra remembered asking Jim if he minded taking Christopher along with him, and he said he didn't mind. He was picking up Wendy from her mother's house and they'd all go see Santa together. So Christopher excitedly ran into their bedroom and got himself dressed. Debbie reminded him to brush his teeth before he ran out the door with Steyers behind him. "See you later, alligator," he yelled back to his mother, and she responded with, "In a while, crocodile." So when Debra looked back on that morning, she would regret ever letting him out that door. It hadn't been a pre-planned trip to see Santa, because that was something she would have liked to have shared with her son. But Christopher had been so excited, and she saw no harm in letting him go with Jim Steyers. After all, Steyers had been great with Christopher, and his daughter Wendy would be with them. Despite his issues, she believed that he loved his daughter and would take good care of the 2 young children, so she really had no worries at that time about that.
No, Debra said that she went about her chores that morning, believing that Christopher would return with happy stories about his meeting with Santa. She made coffee, cleaned the apartment, spoke with a friend on the phone. Debra would say that she got up about 10 o'clock in the morning, and that Steyers and Christopher had left an hour later. Now, the state of Arizona agreed with this timeline, but her friend Carmen Santana would say that she had talked on the phone with Debra at about 9 a.m.
Right, so it seems like Debra was maybe off with her times. Carmen couldn't remember if she had called Debra or if Debra had called her, but she told investigators that she was sure the call had happened by 9 a.m. And in that call, Carmen said, Debra had told her that Jim Steyers and Christopher had gone to see Santa Claus. She didn't know that several other people would also tell the police that they had seen Jim and Christopher leave long before 11 a.m. So Carmen and Debra agreed to talk later that day about some possible evening plans. It was Saturday, and Saturday night was the only night of the week that Debra gave to herself. The other nights were devoted to caring for her son. Jim Steyers or her neighbor would babysit Christopher on Saturday nights. She and Carmen liked to hang out in Tempe, where many of the students from Arizona State University partied on the weekends. Debra had told Carmen that they might be able to hit the bars later because she and Jim Steyers had plans to buy a Christmas tree that night. So now and then Debra did go out on dates, and she'd been seeing a young man named Ernie for a while, but that was over by this time. So most of the time she went out with her girlfriends. She spent that Saturday morning cleaning up the apartment, checking the mail, and then sitting on the front steps talking with her next-door neighbor, Karen. She'd seen Karen nearly every day since she moved in that July. Debra was friendly with Karen and her husband, John, who'd had a headache that morning that landed him in the emergency room. So when John got home from the hospital about 10:30 a.m., with orders for Demerol and Vistaril and rest, he saw Debra on the steps and said hello before he entered his apartment. So it really does seem that Debra had her times mixed up, and whether that was just an error or on purpose, we really don't know. But Karen and John had two sons that were 5 and 7 years old, and they were Christopher's best buddies. So Karen and John both described Debra as a hardworking single mother who loved her son. But then at 2:45 p.m., Debra's phone rang, and it was Jim Steyers. He told Debra that Christopher was missing from the Metro Center Mall. He said that he had used a stall in a public bathroom there, and when he came out, Christopher was gone. So Debra would recall screaming into her phone, "Jim, you've got to find him, you've got to find him. How did this happen?" And I guess she was so loud that neighbors heard her screams and came to see what was wrong. And they would say that they found Debra shaking and hysterical, because all the neighbors knew Debra and Christopher, and the ones who sat on the front stoop and watched their children play together with her saw that she was a very distraught woman. Karen would recall, she was being hysterical. She was going, "What if something happened to him? What if this happened? What if that happened?" Even though we were all telling her, no, nothing happened, he just wandered off. He's a little kid. Something caught his eye and he just walked off. But she was nervous, like any parent would be. Debra would recall that the first thing she did after getting the call from Jim was to call her dad. She was sobbing, and Richard told her to take deep breaths and calm down. Richard remembered that phone call. He said her first words were inaudible. He couldn't understand her because she was crying and was emotional. So he remembered raising his voice to get her to calm down, and it worked. Then he told her to call mall security and give them a description of Christopher. When Debra asked her dad if she should call the police, he told her no. This was a missing child and it happens all the time. He told her to call him back if she didn't hear anything in the next half an hour. So there's a mistake right there, to not call the police right away.
Yeah, why did he tell her not to call?
Well, I guess he just thought the kid wandered off and they'd find him and it wouldn't be a big deal.
Yeah, but it seemed a natural response to get the police involved.
Yep, I agree. So in exactly a half an hour, Debra called her father back. She told him that Jim had gotten help in the mall to look for Christopher, but she didn't think that was enough, so he told her, go ahead and call the police. She did, and then she waited by the phone, praying that Christopher would call her. Later, she would be criticized for not going to the mall to search for her son. But remember, she didn't have her car, and also she wanted to be there if he called because she had taught Christopher the home number. She'd made a point of doing that.
Yeah, and that doesn't seem like a big issue to me.
Well, you just have to think that people are going to start looking at her and picking through what she did and criticizing it.
Absolutely.
And that's going to be used against her.
Yeah, but you've got a ton of people at the mall looking for him. And like she said, on the chance that he might call, because he knew the number, it'd be good to be there.
Exactly, and I think lots of times they do tell the parents, or at least one of the parents, to stay by the phone.
Yeah. So when the police officers arrived, they asked Debra a lot of questions, and she answered them. They wanted a picture of Christopher. So Debra had several photo albums full of them. Her favorite photo was when she'd had blown up and sent to her grandparents in Berlin from Christopher's first birthday. He's wearing a baby blue outfit with a baseball and bat embroidered on the shirt. I absolutely love this picture, she told everyone. That's not the picture she gave them, though, is it?
She'd made a copy for the grandparents, and she had one in the book. But then she had more recent ones as well, if that's what you're getting at.
Yeah,
yes.
This is a first birthday picture.
Yeah, I think it's just she's going through looking for a recent photo, and her son's missing. She's emotional. Those pictures are going to mean a real lot to you at that moment, for sure.
Yeah.
And she just said that, you know.
So Debra was asked if Jim Steyers was her boyfriend. She said no, and she explained her temporary living arrangements. Neighbors said that they knew there was nothing romantic going on between Debra and Jim. Jim's older sister, Linda, said the same thing. She said, "My brother called everybody honey or darling, but that was just his way. He and Debbie cared about each other a lot, but it wasn't a sexual thing. He loved her, but not like that." And Debra's dad agreed with that assessment also. So then police asked Debra if there was a gun in the house, and she showed them the one in the box at the top of Jim's closet. She didn't remember the bullet she'd found the night before that she'd put in her purse.
Yeah, and that's another thing that will be held against her. Why did you have bullets in your purse?
Yeah, why indeed.
But I can certainly see forgetting something like that in a moment where you're panicked about your child.
Sure.
So she was asked about Jim, the man who had taken her son to the mall, and she and the neighbors all vouched for him. He babysat Christopher while Debra worked. He had also babysat other kids in the apartment complex and was raising his own 2-year-old daughter. And, of course, he was a regular churchgoer. So they all saw him as a man who could be trusted. Police had to question whether Jim might have something to do with Christopher's disappearance, but Debra said she couldn't believe that. And neither could any of the neighbors who knew him. Her neighbors were with her as she cried all that afternoon and all night. Her friend Carmen poured her a rum and coke to try and calm her down. And at nightfall, she gave Debra a sleeping pill. But nothing worked. Debra got worse. She couldn't sleep. And when the phone rang, she leapt for it, hoping it was Christopher.
Yeah, she couldn't eat or sleep, and there was just no good news coming for her. The phone call that she'd rushed to pick up told her that Christopher had not been found. The same sad news came in throughout the night. And at midnight, 2 men from the apartment complex drove to Metro Center to help in a search for Christopher, and they got back at 4 a.m. Christopher is still missing. Debra's miserable, and everyone told her to stay at the house and wait for the phone, not knowing that this would later be used against her.
Well, Jim Steyers had volunteered to help with the search, and he did show some concern for Christopher. But one of the policemen at the mall asked him which stall he had used, and when he showed him the stall, it had no toilet seat. So they were kind of suspicious right then about his whole story of going to the bathroom and then Christopher being missing. And that night, just after midnight, Steyers mentioned his old high school friend, Roger Scott, who lived with his elderly mother.
And what context was he mentioning him in?
That he had seen him that day.
Okay.
Because he was there, and we'll get into what happened. But the police contacted Roger Scott, who made inconsistent statements. So he and Steyers were taken to the Phoenix Police Department for further questioning. Definitely they are suspects at this point. But it wasn't until 11:30 a.m. the next day, Sunday, December 3rd, when someone mentioned that a man named Roger Scott was being questioned. And when Debra heard this, she didn't understand what was going on. She said that Steyers knew she didn't like Scott. She found him to be creepy, and she'd even told Steyers that she didn't want her son around Roger Scott.
Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon that day, Scott's interrogation was taken over by veteran police detective Armando Saldate. According to Saldate's report of this interrogation, Scott admitted that he knew where Christopher's body was, and Scott even volunteered to lead the police to the location. But at the same time, he claimed that it was Jim Steyers who had shot the boy. Then, maybe a half hour or more later, Scott suddenly claimed that the homicide had happened because the boy's mother wanted it done. Christopher's body, shot 3 times in his head, was found exactly where Scott said it would be. So within 24 hours, they've recovered the body.
Yes. So Debra's stepmother, Maureen, and her stepsister, Karen, came to Phoenix on Saturday night to be with her. And they would say they found Debra so distressed that Maureen gave her a Valium to help her calm down. But still, Debra didn't sleep. Then, at about noon on Sunday, Maureen suggested that Debra go to the town of Florence, where her father and paternal grandmother were. And Phoenix police officers at the scene agreed that this was a good idea. So they arrived at her father's house, and her 80-year-old grandmother held Debra as she wept. Her father hugged her and tried to get her to eat something. Her grandmother made her a sandwich, and Debra managed to get down about half of it. Her dad gave her a beer, and he would recall that she drank about half of that. As they sat around the dining room table, Debra just kept asking about Jim Steyers. She wanted to know what was going on. So Debra was tucked into her grandmother's bed and finally did fall asleep. And at about 6 p.m., her stepsister Karen shook her awake and told her that the police were at the front door. And at the front door, an officer told her she had to go to the county jail to talk to some Phoenix police officers. She asked the sheriff if they knew anything about Christopher yet, and he said no. So a family friend, Janet Frobe, drove her to the jail.
Now, meanwhile, Detective Saldate had decided to arrest Debra before she had even arrived at the jail. In his own December 5th police report, written 3 days after this interrogation, Saldate wrote, "At approximately 19:53 hours, it's almost 8 p.m., I explained to Debra that her son Chris had been found in a desert area and that he had been shot to death. Debra immediately began to yell, 'What? What?' She then started to scream and make noises as if she was crying, but no tears were visible."
Well, that's never good when you don't have the tears visible.
Yeah, you got to produce those tears.
The axe will fall.
Otherwise, you're going to be accused of faking it.
Absolutely.
I explained to her that I would not tolerate her crying. And, by the way, you're also under arrest for your son's death.
So that's extremely harsh.
Yeah, that's a smooth way of putting that, isn't it?
God, it's kind of awful. I mean, even if you're really sure she's guilty, maybe that's not the way to handle it.
No. When she arrived at the jail, Debra was put into a room, which she would describe as a medical exam room, with Janet. Janet was asked to leave the room before Detective Saldate spoke to Debra, and Debra would remember screaming after Saldate spoke to her. She was screaming because she couldn't believe what he was saying to her, and she became fairly hysterical. Now, for Debra, her son's murder was only the first tragedy she would face. After spending over 30 hours crying and waiting for any word of her son, she was to be interviewed by Detective Armando Saldate. This detective has a history of lying, under oath, and coercing confessions, although that wasn't known at the time.
Well, she didn't know that, but some people did know it, who probably should have acted on it. But we'll definitely get into that.
According to Debra, Saldate said, "We found your son, he was murdered, and you're under arrest."
So she's there thinking her son is missing, and she's going to help find him, if she is innocent, right?
Right.
And she's finding out that he was murdered and that she's under arrest. Right then and there.
Right there.
So Debra later hand-wrote this account of what happened. So she wrote, "At approximately 8 p.m., a man dressed in civilian clothes entered the room alone, introduced himself as Detective Saldate, asked which of us was Debra, and then asked Janet to step out of the room. As Janet left the room, Saldate closed the door. He sat down in the chair that sat in front of the desk. I immediately asked him if he had heard anything about Chris, but he ignored me. He had a notepad and a pen. He wrote some things down on paper and looked at his watch. Then he looked up at me and said in one breath, 'We found your son, he was murdered, and you are under arrest.' So Debra said she instantly screamed, began crying, and yelled out. And as she was crying uncontrollably, Saldate said, 'I'm not going to tolerate your crying.'
Yeah, man up.
So she moaned and asked, 'Why are you doing this?' She says she was in shock because of the horror that her son was dead, and the disbelief that she was being accused as a participant. Detective Saldate wasn't the only one who knew that he had walked into that room to arrest Debra. 2 police reports would show that before he came out of his 25-minute interview with Debra, police officers told at least 4 people that Debra was being arrested for Christopher's murder. So they could only have known that if they'd been told this before Saldate even entered the interrogation room. So he was not there to talk to her. He was there to accuse her and arrest her.
That's right. So Saldate claimed that Debra had confessed to planning Christopher's murder in that 25-minute time period when she was alone with him. His version of what was said portrayed Debra as a murderer who admitted to her guilt with no signs of remorse. He claimed that she had given him reasons for wanting her child dead. But her version of what was said portrayed Saldate as a bully who had assaulted her mentally and emotionally and had distorted her words. No one can even know for sure what was said because the interview wasn't recorded. And this is even though Saldate had been told by his supervisor to record the interrogation. So how do you even take what was or was not said if you don't have it recorded? I mean,
That's a good question. It was just his word against hers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would think if he had been told, make sure you record this conversation, then he better damn well do it.
You would think so, but he didn't even take a tape recorder with him, and he would later say that he didn't own one, and he would say on the stand at Debra's trial that it was his habit and custom not to use a tape recorder. And it wasn't legally required, even though his supervisor had told him to do it. Another odd thing about this was that the prosecution would make a point during the trial that when Detective Saldate began the interview, he asked Debra, "Can I record this interview?" And he would say that Debra answered, "No, I want a lawyer."
So then you stop and you get the lawyer.
Yeah, right. That's another problem. Saldate's police report added, "It should be noted that this interview was not tape recorded because Debra refused to have her statement recorded." So the prosecutors would then make this incredible assertion that Debra's response of no was the reason that her confession wasn't recorded, as if there'd been a tape recorder in the room, and as if the detective doing the interview would have used a recorder if not for her wishes not to be recorded. So this really makes no sense because in Arizona it's legal for one person to record another without their knowledge or consent. So asking for her permission wasn't even a real thing.
No.
Plus there was not even a recorder there. Plus, she asked for a lawyer, and he even admitted that. So Debra said it actually happened like this. Saldate asked her if she wanted their interview to be recorded. She saw the phone in the room and said no, she wanted to use that phone. She wanted to call her dad about getting a lawyer. She told Saldate that she wanted a lawyer, and then he put his hands on her knees, and he said that he wasn't there to tolerate her behavior. So he was very condescending, and he ignored her request for an attorney. But a tape recorder wasn't even the only way to prove what Debra had said in that room. The interrogation could have been witnessed by another law enforcement officer. In fact, 2 Phoenix homicide detectives were waiting outside the door. They were prepared to do the interview themselves until they were told to wait and let Saldate do it. But neither officer was ever asked to sit in on that interview. So why would he do it alone when he has 2 other detectives there who could have witnessed it?
Why, indeed. Also, the confession could have been typed up and signed by Debra, but there was never a signed confession. The only thing saying that there was a confession that night was a paraphrased report by Saldate, claiming he was reporting what Debra had said to him. Debra has always maintained that she confessed to nothing, and she was guilty of nothing. But Saldate claimed that Debra had been suicidal, but she decided to have her son killed instead because she didn't want him to be raised by his father, Mark Milke. Saldate said, "She told me that she had gotten the idea about a month ago about killing the child. She said that at first she thought about suicide, but then decided not to because the child would then be released to her husband, ex-husband. She said that she wanted the child killed because he was starting to act like her husband. She said she loved the child and she wanted him to go with God and not have to live in the house that her husband did. She indicated that she talked to Jim Steyers, her roommate, and then that he agreed to kill her son. She said that he later got in touch with Roger Scott, his friend, and that all three of them discussed doing this, and Debra indicated that she was never angry that they had not done it. She was disappointed on several occasions that they did take him out and hadn't done it, but she wasn't angry. Saldate added that Debra knew that the men were going to kill Christopher that morning and then go to Sears in the Metro Center Mall and claim that Christopher had disappeared.
So Debra remembered that Saldate repeated to her that he wouldn't tolerate her crying, and then he took a card out of his pocket and read her the Miranda warning. Debra said she could hear him talking, but she really didn't understand what he was saying. Her emotions consumed her, which is understandable, and she told him that she didn't understand her rights at all. She didn't understand why he was reading them to her, but she would recall him wheeling his chair up to her so that her back was up against the wall of the room. She had just learned that her son was dead, and she felt very intimidated and confused. She remembered another important thing about her interrogation. Saldate told her, "I don't want you to say a word at all when we leave this room." She said by then she was in such shock that she was numb. She remembered walking out and seeing a lot of people in the lobby. She was walked to the police car outside. Saldate put her in the back seat and got in beside her, and before the driver got in the car, Saldate reminded her to say nothing. She still didn't realize what was happening, though. In her confused state, she believed that she was arrested for being a bad mother and letting Christopher go with Jim Steyers. As they drove to Phoenix, she thought Saldate was taking her home to her apartment, but they arrived at the police station, and then reporters photographed her as she walked into the building. So it sounds like she was just so upset, which is understandable, and she's feeling guilt for letting her son go at all. And then he's trying to turn that guilt into guilt for actually being part of the murder.
Yeah, he certainly is. So Scott, Steyers, and Debra were all arrested for the murder of Christopher Milke. Debra's trial began on September 10, 1990. The pre-trial reporting in the news was very critical of her. And Debra had a public defender who turned out to be completely ineffective against the county prosecutor, Noel Levy. Debra's sister, Sandy, testified for the prosecution.
Can you believe that?
Whoa.
Yeah.
My sister.
Yep.
She told the jury that Debra had been a negligent mother and that she had likely killed her son so she could get back together with an ex-boyfriend named Ernie. According to Sandy, Ernie did not want to have any children, so Christopher was in the way of that relationship. Sandy was also very negative about her sister in general, called her a manipulative person. In addition to her sister, Mark Milke, the ex-husband, and Debra's father, Richard, also turned against her and said they were not surprised that she was behind the murder. So your sister and your father.
Yes, amazing, isn't it?
Wow.
Yeah. Well, Detective Saldate became the star witness against Debra, as you can imagine, with the only real evidence being the unrecorded and unwitnessed confession. Saldate read from his report that Debra had told him that after Christopher's birth, she realized she was not going to be a good mother, but that the alternative of having Christopher stay with his father was not any better. She finally got a divorce from Mark, and then Mark did end up with some visitation rights. For the most part, Mark was always in jail and he couldn't even take advantage of those rights. Mark had been having Christopher for visitation, and she noticed that Christopher was acting just like her ex-husband. So she had described to him, according to Saldate, that Christopher was very mischievous, and that this really bothered her because she didn't want her child to grow up and be like Mark, spending his life in and out of jail. Saldate said, "Debra then told me that she felt very bad about this, and she had a very empty feeling. Then she said, 'I'm not a malicious person, I just wanted God to take care of him.'" He added that Debra then told him that she was scared about what was going to happen. But Debra would recount the same scene very differently. She would say that she became upset when Saldate accused her of lying, that she couldn't stop crying. She said the emotional turmoil was difficult to bear, that her brain couldn't process the sudden shock of the devastating news of Christopher's murder and then of her arrest. But Saldate's police report continued. I then asked Debra if she had killed her son because of some insurance that she may have had on him, and she told me she did not. She then said she didn't have any life insurance on him, but believed that maybe her father did. She also said she believes that her father was the beneficiary of that policy. Then Saldate said he told Debra that it had been his understanding that Jim and Roger were to receive a partial payment of the $5,000 policy which she had on her child's life. Now, Debra had denied having a policy, but she may have told Jim about her father's policy, and she said that it may have been Jim Steyers and Roger Scott's motivation for the killing, but it definitely wasn't hers. So Debra acknowledged that she had told Saldate that she didn't have a life insurance policy on Christopher. And at trial, prosecutor Noel Levy told the jury Debra was lying about the life insurance policy, that she had taken out a $5,000 life insurance policy on her son, and pointed out that this was the official motivation for Debra to have her son killed. So this is a very disturbing image they're sending to the jury.
Boy, isn't it?
A mother so heartless that she went out and bought a $5,000 life insurance policy on her own child with the intent of having him killed and collecting the money. And the jury accepted this as Debra's motive. But actually, Debra never took out a $5,000 life insurance policy on Christopher. It was part of her benefit package at the insurance agency where she worked. Debra recalled that it was explained to her as a $5,000 burial policy. And this was actually the same benefit package offered to every full-time employee at that company. And this insurance policy did not pay off in the event of any criminal behavior. So if Debra had had Christopher murdered, this policy would not be payable to anyone. But one problem in her trial was that both Debra and her defense attorney thought the life insurance motivation would be so easily dismissed that they didn't take it seriously as a provable motive. But in fact, everyone seemed to accept that motive very readily. In fact, the Murderpedia website listed her crime as parricide to collect insurance money.
I'm not impressed with her attorney.
No, and a lot of people have talked about that, and looking back, maybe he wasn't a bad guy, but just not qualified, especially for a death penalty case, which this was.
Yeah, I mean, if she had said she asked for an attorney when she was interrogated by Saldate, and they continue to question her, that's something you bring up at trial.
Well, at least have it not admissible at trial, right? The whole confession.
They admitted all of it.
Yes, they did.
And this whole thing about the $5,000 life insurance policy, which it really wasn't, should have been refuted.
Oh yeah, that definitely should have been addressed by the defense. So this was a capital case, meaning a case where the prosecution was going to ask for the death penalty. What was revealing about the prosecutor's statement to the grand jury was that he misrepresented that $5,000 burial policy that was part of Debra's employee package at work as something that she went out and sought. But he also attributed a motive of financial gain to only the two men, Scott and Steyers. The prosecutor would later change this story and insist that Debra had her son killed to collect the insurance money in her trial. So that wasn't even kept straight.
Amazing. So in October 1990, Debra Milke was found guilty after one day of deliberation by the jury. A private investigator interviewed one of the jurors who told him that the jury had been split 50-50 until they requested to listen to an audio tape. Now, this audio tape was a conversation between Detective Saldate and Debra's sister Sandy, and it had not been played during the trial. But because some information from the tape had been brought up in Sandy's testimony, the tape was in evidence. So in this tape, Sandy spoke at length about Debra being a master of manipulation who had tried to pawn off Christopher often so that she could go out and party. And according to one juror, Listening to that tape had convinced the remaining 50% to convict.
Yeah, and this investigator was pretty stunned by that because he thought it must have been the confession. But it seemed like the negative things said by her family members and the people that turned on her really worked against her, maybe even more than the false confession.
Yeah, they seemed to carry more weight.
Yes. Plus, she did testify, and she didn't cry on the stand, and she was described by the media as cold. So Debra was sentenced to death in January of 1991. Both Jim Steyers and Roger Scott were convicted, and both men were sentenced to death as well. During her post-conviction proceedings, Debra Milke and her counsel found evidence that had been suppressed at the time of her trial. In particular, they learned that Detective Saldate had a long, documented history of violating suspects' constitutional rights, fabricating evidence, and perjuring himself in order to secure convictions. He'd also engaged in sexual misconduct with women who he had under his control. In fact, Saldate had been repeatedly found by Arizona courts to have lied on the stand about witness statements and about confessions. Both the Phoenix PD and the Maricopa County Attorney's Office were aware of his history of misconduct, but neither did anything to investigate or discipline Saldate. There were no efforts to share knowledge of his history to any of these defense attorneys in the cases that Saldate investigated either, and this included capital cases like Debra's.
And then it came to light that the Phoenix Police Department continued to promote and support Saldate. They even continued to bring him in to handle some of their most important cases, which included Debra Milke's case. County Attorney's Office continued to depend on Saldate's testimony and to make him the star of their cases. The prosecutor, Noel Levy, won repeated accolades for convictions that he got based on Saldate's work.
Yeah, so they have a motive to keep him there.
Yeah.
It's really rotten. There was no adequate internal investigation of the allegations against Saldate by either his supervisors at the Phoenix PD or even by the Phoenix Police Department Internal Affairs Division. Plus, he was never disciplined for any of it. Now, Saldate had this documented history of engaging in sexual misconduct on the job, harassing young women, and lying to his superiors. And this went back as far as 1973, when Saldate, then a patrol officer, attempted to extort and coerce sexual favors from a female motorist, whom Saldate had stopped for having a faulty tail light. So after pulling over the woman and learning that she had an outstanding warrant, instead of arresting her, Saldate suggested they move to a less conspicuous spot, and then he followed her somewhere in his cruiser. Once there, he sexually assaulted her. And to put him off, she offered to meet him somewhere later to have sex with him. So he agreed to that, and Saldate showed up for that rendezvous. But the woman didn't show up. Instead, she reported his misconduct to the police. And when this misconduct came to the Phoenix Police Department's attention, officials did open an investigation. When he was questioned by investigators, Saldate lied about the incident until he failed a polygraph test. In the disciplinary report that resulted, signed by the police chief and city manager, Saldate was told that because of this incident, your image of honesty, competency, and overall reliability must be questioned. So his personnel file contained the internal investigation report showing these conclusions, and that at this time, Saldate was suspended for 5 days. Big deal.
Big deal.
He gets a week off, really.
And then Saldate conducted a similar sexual misconduct in 2009. This is while Debra's habeas claims were being litigated. In 2009, Saldate extorted a woman for sex in exchange for letting her avoid an eviction. And this woman reported the incident to Saldate's supervisor, who advised her to contact the Phoenix PD, which she did. Police department report stated that Saldate committed bribery and theft by extortion when he suggested that the woman have sexual intercourse with him to keep him from locking her out of her apartment after she was evicted.
So you have these claims, and you have to wonder how many of these incidents occurred where the woman did not report it. There had to be several.
You would think.
You would think so.
Plus, he's gotten away with it.
Repeatedly. Yeah, over years and years.
So no evidence of Saldate's proven pattern of serious misconduct was ever disclosed to Debra or her attorney before the trial. Instead, the vast majority of evidence was uncovered with thousands of hours of meticulous research by her post-conviction legal team, who was examining public records. By the time the Phoenix PD finally was ordered to produce Saldate's personnel file, years after Debra's conviction, they said almost all of that file had been destroyed. You're kidding me.
No. Isn't that outrageous? I mean, just coincidentally, it's been destroyed?
Yeah.
What the fuck? That's just ridiculous. When Saldate's record finally came before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, the panel issued a unanimous decision chastising Saldate for his egregious misconduct, as well as the Phoenix PD and the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for their roles in covering up crucial evidence of his history. So, outrageous, really crazy.
Yeah.
I really don't think any conviction with him testifying would be valid.
Right. Well, we'll see what happens to Debra.
Yes, but I think Debra's one of the more fortunate ones, even though she lived through many years of hell, it seems.
Well, it took a while. And
took a long while.
All her appeals were denied.
Yes, for quite some time.
So I'm just not sure how you can do that. You got this detective who lied, who has this sordid history. None of that testimony should be allowed.
Yeah, but we're going to see that there were many judges over the years who said that it just didn't matter. It didn't affect the outcome of her case, which seems crazy to me.
I don't know how you can say that.
I know. Well, let's just look back a little bit here, because when we look at the details of Debra's case, it seems that Jim Steyers drove to Roger Scott's on the day of Christopher's murder in order to give him a gun that he had bought for him for $25. Both of the men had gone target shooting beforehand. Jim Steyers had planned to pick up his daughter Wendy, but then Wendy's mother had told him to wait until afternoon. So Steyers and Scott had some time to kill, and they decided to go out to the desert north of Phoenix and do some target shooting. At his own trial, Jim Steyers gave the most credible scenario, I believe, for what happened that day. According to his testimony, he, Scott, and Christopher walked back towards the car with Steyers in front, then Christopher, and then Scott behind them. Steyers said that he heard 3 quick shots and turned to see little Christopher lying dead in the sand. According to Steyers, Scott then pointed the gun at him and said something about $250, which he needed to hire an attorney for his Social Security benefits. Steyers was able to calm down Scott, and he drove back to the city, leaving Christopher's body in the desert. As they drove, Scott tossed the shells out of the car window, and police would never recover all of the shells. The 2 men then stopped at a Walgreens where Scott picked up a prescription. Then they went to a pizza place where there was a children's birthday party being held. Over a pizza and drinks, they decided that Steyers would drop off Scott at an Osco Drugs close to his apartment. Then Jim drove to the Metro Center Mall by himself. Once there, he pretended to have lost Christopher while he had left him alone for a moment to use the bathroom. Then about an hour later, Scott arrived at the mall by bus, because his role was to tell the police that he had seen Christopher and Jim Steyers together at the mall. Police later found the murder weapon in the apartment that Scott shared with his elderly mother, and it appears that there was no deeper motive than Roger Scott being with Steyers and Christopher, and that Scott was mentally unstable. Apparently, Scott never liked the child because he was hyperactive. Scott also had a history of shooting at random people in alleys.
What?
So there's a red flag.
No kidding.
An interview with a fellow inmate of Scott would say that Scott confessed to him that he had killed the child completely on his own. Scott had even turned down an offered plea deal if he would testify that Debra was the mastermind of a plot to have her child killed, even though this agreement would have saved him from a death sentence. But we don't know why Steyers covered for Roger Scott.
Yeah, that's a weird thing.
It's a weird thing, and it's definitely wrong. Any way you look at it, yes.
Yeah. So after their arrests, Jim and Debra exchanged over 40 letters. Prosecutors and some people in the media characterized these as love letters between co-conspirators. Some said they showed Debra as a cold, heartless woman, more concerned about herself than what had happened to her son. Some said these letters were evidence of guilt. But a completely different reality comes to light when the letters are all read. The letters are filled with confusion, grief, anger, and depression. There was repeated regret and misery about Christopher's death and what his loss meant to his mother. And there were questions about how the horrible events of December 2nd had happened. In her letters, it was clear that Debra was unaware that Jim had brought a gun for Roger. In his letters, Jim kept evading her questions because he knew she'd be upset with him for having a gun in the car along with her son and Roger Scott, a very unstable man.
Well, Roger Scott didn't write one single letter to either Jim or Debra, the people who were supposedly his co-conspirators. But Scott told the police several different stories, and all of them named Jim Steyers as the shooter. In one version, Scott said he didn't know what was happening that day and was scared when Steyers killed Christopher. In another version, he claimed that he had been promised $250 in insurance money if he drove the getaway car. And that was all that he did, was drive. But Roger Scott allegedly confessed to a fellow inmate that he was the one who shot Christopher. Now, even though this fellow inmate was only in jail for a short time on marijuana charges, the prosecutor had no interest in listening to him. Scott also told him a more detailed story about killing Christopher. In this story, Scott admitted that he had killed Christopher himself because he was mad at Steyers. The two sources of this anger were money and jealousy. Scott was angry at Steyers because he hadn't received some money that Steyers had promised him. He also wanted to go out partying with Steyers that Saturday night, but Steyers had told him that he and Debra and the kids had plans to get a Christmas tree. But anyway, in all of Scott's versions, one thing was consistent. Scott was the one who shot and killed Christopher Milke.
But Roger Scott was the state's only witness to testify about Christopher's murder. And he was the only person who would say Steyers and Debra had plotted it and offered him $250 to help them kill the boy. Both Steyers and Debra professed their innocence over and over again, claiming they had nothing to do with it and that Scott was making up the entire story. Now, after Debra was given her death sentence, it took the courts 15 days to decide where to put her. You see, Arizona doesn't have a death row for women, and prison officials had to create a place for Debra, who was the only female death row inmate. From her solitary cell, Debra was able to watch violence that she'd never imagined women could do against each other. Good place she was in.
Well, it's prison.
Sounds like a rough prison.
Yes. During her first year in prison, Debra enrolled in a male correspondence course through the Paralegal Specialist Program. Tuition was close to $1,000, and she had to pay $35 a month. In this program, she studied many different aspects of the law, from the paralegal's role in the legal profession, criminal law, torts, and contract law. She also studied investigations, evidence, legal research, and legal writing. She got 9 perfect scores of 100, and the rest of her tests she got 95s, so she graduated with honors, and the courses helped her understand her legal case. For close to 2 years, Debra had no contact with her mom. The last time she'd spoken with her was over the desperate phone calls on the day that Christopher was killed. Debra was lied to while in jail and told that her mother didn't want to talk to her. She'd been unable to get her mother's address to send a letter to her. But then in late 1991, Debra made one last attempt. She wrote her mother a 32-page letter that explained what had happened. She told Renata that her father and sister had betrayed her. She begged her mother to understand and to see that she'd been railroaded by a dishonest detective. The only address she had was her grandparents in Berlin, and on the envelope she wrote in German, "Grandma and Grandpa, it isn't true. For my mother and Alex, please, Grandma, please. So the letter arrived, and Debra's grandmother called Renata immediately. Renata had had no idea that Sandy and Richard had testified against Debra. Once she was able to read what Debra had felt and what Debra had been through, she was really shocked and appalled. But she was also relieved to hear that her daughter Debra was innocent. She immediately wrote back to Debra, and she promised that she would take care of everything. Then, at Debra's suggestion, Renata sent Debra's letter to her trial attorney. Renata later called his office, and she was told by his secretary that yes, the letter had arrived, and they'd forwarded it to Debra. But for some reason, Debra never received that letter. So when Debra never received a response from her mother, she felt really heartbroken. And meanwhile, Renata had been waiting for a response from Debra. So finally, Renata wrote a letter to her daughter and sent it directly to the prison. And Debra got that letter.
Finally. So when she received the letter, there was a renewed sense of hope. You got someone else in your corner.
That had to mean a lot.
With her mother by her side, she felt that she could work at proving her innocence. So Renata started a campaign to raise funds for legal help in getting a successful appeal. And in the end, she was able to raise up to $215,000. That's a significant amount of cash.
Yes, but that wasn't all at once. That came later.
I know.
But still, she's lucky for that, because a lot of people were in prison from Saldate's so-called confessions,
right,
who had no help and are probably still in prison, or maybe even have been put to death. So on December 21st, 1993, Arizona's highest court rejected Debra's appeal. They affirmed her conviction for murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping, and again said she deserved the death penalty. When the United States Supreme Court was asked to review that decision, they declined. To go any farther, to file any other appeals, Debra had to either have money to hire an attorney or have an attorney volunteer to help her. And she didn't have much money yet. This was only 93.
Yeah. Well, as luck would have it, the defense attorney, Anders Rosenquist, showed up at the prison to tell Debra that he would help her. Now, Rosenquist was a well-known attorney in Arizona. He had worked for the Maricopa County Public Defender's Office, rising to senior attorney with an impressive record of 8 straight not guilty jury verdicts. He then formed his own criminal defense firm in 1983. And at the time of Debra's trial, he had moved to California, so at least initially he hadn't paid much attention to her case. But when he moved back to Arizona, he became interested in exonerating Debra. He later said that he had received a call from a counselor at the prison who asked him to look into Debra's case. So it seems like the general feeling is that she's an innocent woman wrongly convicted.
Well, I don't know about the general feeling, but definitely a lot of people feel that way. And this attorney, very experienced, believed that she was unjustifiably convicted. Yes.
Yeah, well, that's what you want, an effective attorney.
Yes. Well, when he got a transcript of the trial, he said what he read disgusted him. Instead of a solid murder case, he found what he saw as a character assassination with really no actual evidence. He also read claims of a confession with no proof. And without the confession, they really had nothing against Debra. He knew that the jury had believed Saldate, and so had the media, so the entire case was bad. There was a lot of work to do. So he did go to the prison to meet Debra. And Rosenquist took the case pro bono. One of the first things he did was to talk to Debra's psychiatrist. The media had made a lot of Debra's flat affect when she testified about her son's murder. But Rosenquist learned that Debra had been heavily medicated at the time to keep her from being hysterical and suicidal. So this disturbed the psychiatrist when he learned that this had worked against Debra at her trial. There had actually been repeated incidents of Debra suffering from intense grief, which was not getting better over time. During these incidents, she would become extremely upset and break down crying. She would cry and say, I abandoned my son when I let him go to Metro Center with that man. It is all my fault because I let him go. She never said anything or did anything that would lead any of them to believe that she was involved in the killing of her son. She had consistently maintained her innocence. Her statements and actions were consistent with grief, and they were inconsistent with guilt, other than when she blamed herself for letting Christopher go to the mall that day. But the jury never knew that Debra was medicated when she was on the stand.
Rosenquist thought it was ridiculous that the automatic appeal of Debra's conviction hadn't raised even one challenge to the confession. It never claimed the confession was false or coerced. Reading the lengthy appeal gave no indication that the confession was an issue at all. But Rosenquist knew that was at the center of the case. After all, it's the only evidence that Arizona had against Debra. There had been 2 people in the room, and they told opposing stories. And all Rosenquist had to do is look at other cases that Detective Saldate had handled in the past to see that there had been a pattern of deceit. And Rosenquist was good friends with the presiding judge, who approved an order to give him access to every criminal case in Maricopa County since 1970. Rosenquist and his staff reviewed 18,000 cases, which took 3 months.
Yeah, they found about 300 cases involving Detective Saldate. Another researcher spent a month on motions and trial transcripts to search for any evidence of misconduct. So a total of 18 questionable cases were found. In 7 of those cases, Arizona courts had ruled Saldate had lied under oath. 6 of those cases happened before Debra Milke went on trial. So it's really horrible that her defense lawyer was not privy to any of this information. By the time of Debra's trial, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office had been aware of problems with Saldate for at least 7 years.
And one of the most shocking things was that the courts were questioning Saldate's credibility both before and immediately after Debra's trial. In June of 1990, a judge threw out part of Saldate's interrogation in one case when it became obvious that Saldate had continued questioning the suspect even after he'd invoked his Miranda rights and asked for an attorney. That sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, I think he had a habit of doing things like that.
The judge ruled everything said after the request was inadmissible.
Well, and that's what should have happened with Debra.
Absolutely. In November of 1990, after Debra's conviction, but before her sentencing, the court threw out another murder confession that Saldate had obtained, saying it was the result of an illegal arrest and Saldate's flagrant misconduct. That decision came in a courtroom in the same building where Debra had been tried and convicted.
So it's just amazing to me that these things are happening and not shared. It definitely seems like her court-appointed defense attorney in the beginning was not competent and wasn't up to this job. And I believe since then they have new standards for attorneys who are allowed to defend death penalty cases, because you really have to know what you're doing. You really have to specialize in that sort of thing.
Yeah, we've done a few cases on True Crime Brewery if there's an extra attorney added to the team because they're skilled.
Yeah, they even bring in some very expensive attorneys for people who are getting a public defender to help out.
Right.
And besides the new evidence of Saldate's misconduct, Rosenquist charged that Debra had ineffective counsel for both her trial and her first appeal. But in 1996, Debra lost another appeal, when this judge ruled that Debra and Saldate's version of her confession were substantially the same. So this is outrageous. This judge ruled that the evidence of past wrongdoing by Saldate wasn't evidence at all, but just motions and testimony from other cases in which Detective Saldate was the interrogating officer. So that judge was actually eventually removed from the criminal bench for her bad decision-making in several cases. But then on December 19, 1997, the Arizona Supreme Court denied review of Debra's post-conviction relief appeal. So that meant they didn't think the new evidence was even worthy of reviewing. That's so frustrating.
It is really frustrating. I just don't see how they could do that.
Yeah, regardless of what you think of Debra, if you think she made mistakes as a mother, or that maybe you think she could have been involved, there really isn't the evidence, and the trial was definitely not fair.
A warrant for Debra's execution was to be carried out on January 29, 1998. Debra was terrified. The stay of execution was finally granted on January 12th, just 17 days before her execution date. The stay stopped the execution clock, and Rosenquist went back to trying to get someone to listen to Debra's appeal.
Well, for over 2 decades, Debra continued to lose her appeals. The threat of being killed by lethal injection was always hanging over her head. Throughout Debra's ordeal, she maintained her cautious optimism, and a dark sense of humor helped her cope. Like she remembered that during a practice run of her execution, a doctor was taking her blood when she joked with him, "Well, you might as well check my cholesterol, too." And I could see how you'd have to do that. You have to do something to get by.
Yes.
When you're starting to be treated as someone whose death is inevitable within a couple of weeks, it would have to be terrifying.
Wouldn't it?
Well, just the thought that people want you dead like that would be hard to live with, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Especially if you're innocent. So Debra would describe her experience as 2 tragedies at the same time. First, of course, the loss of her son, and second, her unfair trial and imprisonment. Attorney Mike Kimmerer and his legal team took over Debra's case in 2000, and Kimmerer described cases with an innocent client as the most difficult, and he included Debra among these clients.
Yeah, and eventually her case reached the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and on March 14, 2013, the judges overruled her convictions on the basis of an unfair trial. So Debra's finally released from prison. Kimmerer gave much of the credit to Rosenquist's review of Detective Saldate's other cases.
Oh, I'm sure that was significant.
Wow, had to be. When asked after her release about whether people still perceive her to be a murderer, Debra said, "Well, if you want to be judgmental, fine, but you didn't have to walk in my shoes." Debra did find work as a legal assistant at the law firm of the attorney who helped her win the appeal.
That's something you hear quite often, too.
Yeah.
When the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office said it would retry Debra after that, her attorneys Michael Kimmerer and Lori Vopel filed a motion to dismiss the charges because the prosecutor's conduct was so egregious that a second trial would violate the constitutional prohibition against double jeopardy. In January of 2014, a Maricopa County Superior Court judge denied this motion, ruling that she didn't believe that the evidence of Saldate's misconduct was intentionally concealed or that the original prosecutor, Noel Levy, acted in bad faith. So that's remarkable to me as well.
Yes, it is.
In December 2014, the Arizona Court of Appeals did reverse this ruling, however, and ordered the charges against Debra be dismissed. In finding that a retrial would violate Debra's constitutional protection against double jeopardy, the appeals court said, "We are unable to conclude that the long course of violations in this case are anything but a severe stain on the Arizona justice system."
I would second that. So the prosecution appealed to the Arizona Supreme Court, but in March 2015, the Supreme Court refused to hear the appeal. And on March 23rd, a judge dismissed the charges. Debra's attorneys filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Saldate, who had retired, and as well as numerous other Phoenix police officers and the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office. But in 2020, the lawsuit was dismissed.
Yeah, that was pretty shocking to me because I actually found the documents of her lawsuit, which were extremely convincing. But then I did some more reading and I found that Arizona is not very likely to rule in favor of someone who's suing anyone in the government.
Yeah, okay.
So there's kind of a big wall of protection there.
Yeah.
So what about Steyers and Scott, her supposed co-conspirators? Assuming that Debra Milke is innocent, shouldn't that have some effect on their convictions? Both men were investigated by Detective Saldate, who is now known to have been dishonest, and both men faced the death penalty. Now, Jim Steyers did have his sentence reduced to life in prison because of a Supreme Court ruling which challenged the way Arizona determined death sentence eligibility back in the 1990s. But Roger Scott is kind of a whole different story. He has a low IQ and he has brain damage. And although his IQ wasn't low enough to designate him as intellectually disabled, he was found to have significant deficiencies in reasoning, judgment, and problem solving. The public defender handling Roger Scott's appeal claims that Scott was the least culpable of the three and the only one who may end up being put to death. But Scott's attorney didn't bring up the flaws in the way Arizona courts determined who was eligible for the death penalty like Steyers' attorney did. So really, in these cases, your life is in the hands of how competent and even how motivated your attorney is.
Yeah. And I think how motivated is an important thing.
Well, yeah. And Scott didn't have anyone raising money for him either.
So as of 2015, Scott was still claiming that Debra and Steyers planned Christopher Milke's murder, and that Steyers did the actual shooting. He also claims that Saldate kept him for over 10 hours at the police station before he was read his Miranda rights. Scott had been offered a plea deal of second-degree murder with a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. That was back in 1990, but he declined. And in 2015, Scott said that he refused the plea bargain because he couldn't bring himself to plead guilty to murder.
But, he does have a low IQ. He does have issues. And maybe that wasn't explained to him, that even if he was the driver, he would be just as guilty. He seemed to think if he only drove, then he wasn't guilty.
He didn't participate in the actual shooting.
Right.
Although he's supposedly told another inmate that he had.
Yes, more than once.
So.
And he changed his story a lot. But yeah, I think he's guilty, but still, I don't think his legal representation has been adequate. I think it's been kind of shitty because he's a poor guy and, there's nothing really likable about him for anyone to stand up for him, which is pretty sad. Now, Debra's attorneys have said that Steyers and or Scott actually killed Christopher, but Detective Saldate in the Phoenix PD made it impossible to ever find out what really happened by doing this horrible investigation. So we're never really going to know.
No, you're not. So a formal press conference held by Debra Milke's legal team in March of 2015 ended with Laura Nyrider from the Center on Wrongful Convictions. Nyrider noted that as a law student, she had researched the Debra Milke case and it inspired her to work on wrongful convictions. She urged the press to notice the crucial lessons of Debra's case. 25 states in the District of Columbia require all interrogations be recorded. It's time for Arizona to join their ranks. If you're really angered that it took so long in this case, ask your legislature to require police to get out the camera and record the interrogations. So next time we won't have to wait 25 years.
Well, and that seems like a simple solution, right? It really does.
It does.
But we have seen cases where it is recorded and used against the person when it's clearly coerced, too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not the only problem with getting wrongful convictions or wrongful coerced confessions. So it's just, there's no reason not to record them.
No, there isn't.
No. So TCB's music was produced by Mike McClellan. You can find out more about his work at his website, podcastps.com. If you have comments, a case suggestion, a beer recommendation, anything you'd like to tell us, you can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com. Or even better, we love to get voicemails. There's always a direct link in our show notes that you can click on, and you can record a voicemail for us right on your device. It's very simple, and we love to get case suggestions and just hear from listeners. Recommendations, comments on cases we've covered, anything like that, we would just be very happy to get. Now, if you'd like to support our show and get your episodes ad-free, you can also subscribe at tiegrabber.com. Just go to our website and look at your subscribing options. It's much appreciated when you subscribe, and there are over 150 shows in the premium show feed that you can listen to and binge without ads. You also have the option of subscribing through Patreon by going to patreon.com/tiegrabber.
It's time for listener feedback.
So we have some great feedback on the show today. What have we got, Dickie?
The voicemail is from Tammy, and she has a very interesting case suggestion.
Hi, Jill and Dick. This is Tammy from Texas. I won't do the praise because I've done it before and you guys know I love you, so I'll just skip to the case suggestion. I just heard about this, never heard about this one before. I find it very interesting, and I would love to hear you guys talk about it. A guy named Gregory Green, born in 1966 in Dearborn Heights, Michigan. Around 1990, he married a woman named Tanya. She got pregnant in 1990, and in July of 1991, still pregnant, she told him that she was leaving him. So he killed her and their unborn baby. He was sentenced to 15 to 20 years. He had friends and family that were supporting him the whole time, writing letters. I guess by 2004, he had his first chance at parole. And his mother wrote a letter, his sister wrote a letter. The pastor of their church, named Fred Harris, also wrote a letter. And Gregory Green was denied 4 times before he finally got paroled in 2008. After that, Gregory Green marries Pastor Fred Harris's daughter, Faith. Faith already had 2 children of her own, and then her and Gregory Green had 2 together. And then at some point, and I'm not sure when the first time happened, but she had filed for divorce, but somehow he got her back, or she went back to him. But then on August 11th, 2016, she filed for divorce again. But before that could go anywhere, on September 22nd, 2016, Gregory Green took his wife Faith down to the basement, tied her up. He shot her in the foot. He cut her face. She was laying there dying. He went and killed their 2 young children out of her view. But then he brought her 2 older children, her 2 children, down to the basement, and he killed them in front of her. And then I guess, assuming she was going to die too, he just went upstairs and called 911. And they came, and she actually survived. But he got 45 to 100 years in prison. So, yeah, that's terrible. As far as breweries, Dick, I don't drink, so I don't know. But I did Google, and there are several in Dearborn Heights. So, love you guys.
Well, thanks, Tammy. You know, Dearborn Heights is really not far from where I grew up, actually, so I'm very familiar with the area.
I know. That's why one of the reasons I picked this case.
And I'm pretty shocked I've never heard of this case because this guy's a monster.
This is weirder beyond weird.
Why didn't this get more publicity?
Why?
Well, are these people of color? Perhaps. From what I saw, that could be the reason.
Sure.
Not wealthy people, not white people. But I digress on that. Still, I'm really shocked I hadn't heard about it. And this guy's the monster, like one of the worst I've ever heard of. How horrible. Words cannot express how horrible this is. So, of course, I'd like to cover it.
We'll put it in the to be done file.
Okie dokie.
All right.
And I'm sure that you can come up with some beers from that area. Oh. I know a couple Michigan beers that when we visit my parents there, you always get beer from.
Yeah, that wouldn't be any problem.
Okay, great. All right, so that is definitely on our list. Thanks again, Tammy. Now, we just have a couple emails that we're going to read for you. And the first one's from Richard. So how about my husband, Richard, reads the case suggestion from Richard.
So Richard says, I've been listening to TCB and like how you do your due diligence. This may be a future show. Looking forward to finding out what beer goes with swinging. LOL. Thanks, Richard. So in the case he's referring to is a woman named Christy Evans, who was convicted of killing her
husband, her pastor husband.
She convinced her lover to kill her pastor husband.
Yes.
Just a year and a half ago, March of 2021. She claimed that he was an abusive husband who was a sexual deviant, and he had forced her to have sex with somewhere between 50 and 100 men. Threesomes, foursomes, just kind of gross.
Well, you can believe the abuse, but I think the problem here is that she waited and planned it out. It wasn't done in the heat of the moment.
Right, and she had her lover
do it for her. Right. So you think after being forced with all those men, you wouldn't even want a lover. You'd be like, ugh.
Yeah, no kidding.
But she did plead guilty to first-degree murder, admitting that she had coaxed her lover into shooting her sleeping husband. And she testified that she was immediately remorseful when it happened. Now, her attorney had asked the judge to order her to prison for only 4 years, but that wasn't going to happen.
No.
So she got life in prison, right?
Yes.
No possibility of parole either.
At this point, but I'm sure we're going to be working through the appeals process.
Yeah, and what's funny is her husband, David Evans, was really a beloved Baptist pastor. He had preached about attacks from the devil to his congregation just hours before his death. And he had just returned from a mission trip from Mexico. But he had this double life as a swinger, and there was evidence he collected porn and had arranged for his wife to meet with men in Oklahoma City. So he was a deviant, and he wasn't nice to her.
No, he certainly was not.
So her punishment does seem harsh, but I think it's because it was planned. Like you said, she had someone do it for her. You can't get away with that. That's not cool.
No.
Okay, so one more email I'd like to read, and this is from Jane with a case suggestion. Jane writes, I've been listening to your back catalog of episodes, and currently I'm up to 2018. I enjoyed them so much, especially the soothing timbre of Dick's voice. Thank you, Jane.
Yeah.
I get to go to sleep to that every night. Aren't I lucky?
There's people that like the soothing timbre of my voice, and there's other people that say I speak in a monotone and I'm hard to understand. Yeah, so you take it with a grain of salt.
Well, can't please everybody, and you're not trying to.
No, but Jane likes my voice.
Yes.
And you like my voice.
Yes.
So, I'm good.
Okay. So Jane continues, I have a case suggestion. I know you are inundated with these, but I think this one has all the elements to pique your interest. It's the case of Colin Marr. In 2007, 23-year-old Colin was found dead from a single stab wound to his chest after an argument with his girlfriend. Now, his girlfriend claimed that Colin had stabbed himself. The police appeared to take this at face value, and as such, more or less did nothing to investigate any further into this. I'm not sure I can do justice to telling you the ins and outs of the case, but there are plenty of resources to do this, including YouTube and Facebook pages set up by Colin's family, who are still to this day looking for answers about the death of their much-loved son. Only last year there was a new appeal for any information. Again, this was not done by the police at the time of Colin's death, so perhaps if you do an episode on this, it might even reach someone who has information that could be useful. As for a beer suggestion, Fife in Scotland has many good breweries, however I'm not sure how easy it would be for you to get beers from here. A popular, more mainstream brewery is Innis & Gunn. Perhaps you can source some from there. Again, I really hope you consider covering Colin's case, and thank you for all of your excellent work so far. Looking forward to seeing you at the quiet end. So it has been a while since we've done a case outside of the US and Canada. And if we've done Scotland, it's only been a couple times.
Yeah, I'm not sure we've done any.
Yeah.
So.
I think I recall one from Scotland, but it could have been Ireland. I might be wrong.
Somewhere in the British Isles.
But you can have faith that Dick can get a beer from pretty much anywhere. He's got his connections.
Well, Innis & Gunn you can get here easily in the United States, so.
Okay, I've never heard of it, which is no huge surprise. So Colin Marr died in 2007 from a single knife wound to his chest after an argument with his girlfriend, fiancée Candice Bonar. She claimed he did it intentionally, and a murder inquiry agreed with this. But evidence has been re-examined a couple of times with no new findings. So definitely worth looking into. It's amazing to me that if she did this, she pulled it off, and it's really egregious that no investigation was really done. I do feel bad for his family.
Yeah, it started out with her holding the knife, and he took it and pushed it in his chest.
That's hard to do.
It's hard
right?
to do, and there's some question that we'll need, if we do the case, we'll need to look more deeply into it.
Oh, sure.
Whether he drove the knife, if he did it himself, that he drove the knife between the rib spaces, which would be easy to get a knife in, or if he did it right on the breastbone, the sternum, which would require a heck of a lot of force to drive a knife through that.
Yes.
So, and I'm not sure what I was looking at answered that question. So
we'll need reports to look at.
We'll definitely need reports.
But this is a 23-year-old, so this is really a tragedy.
Oh, it is.
It's a young guy.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll look into that. Thank you very much, Jane.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you to all of our listeners. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time at The Quiet End.
Save a couple seats for you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.